Bom, então vamos começar. Pessoal, bom dia a todos e a todas. Bom dia! Bom dia! Nós estamos muito felizes em trazer o professor Kenneth para conversar conosco sobre esse tema, esporte, ética e educação. Inicialmente, já gostaríamos de agradecer à professora Patrícia e à comissão de pesquisa pela oportunidade desta conferência. Também ao programa de pós-graduação, a comissão de pós-graduação, a professora Cláudia, aqui presente, pela verba disponibilizada pelo programa, por meio do PROEX, para termos esse professor convidado. Então, o professor Kenneth estará aqui conosco toda essa semana. Temos hoje essa conferência e amanhã à tarde, às 2 horas, na sala... Pode ser aqui. A gente vai ainda divulgar a sala, mas teremos aqui às 2 horas uma segunda conferência, The Meaning of Sport. Também é aberta a todos, tá? Então fiquem todos convidados para essa segunda conferência. E também, se alguém tiver interesse em conversar com o professor Kenneth mais tarde, em algum outro momento durante essa semana, até quinta-feira pela manhã, nós estaremos trabalhando aqui na EFE em um projeto de pesquisa. Então, ele estará disponível também, se alguém tem algum interesse relacionado aos temas com os quais ele trabalha. Certo? Então, isso só é possível, tem sido possível pelo incentivo do programa de pós-graduação, principalmente a intenção da internacionalização do nosso programa. Então, esse diálogo com professores e instituições de fora tem sido muito importante, tanto para nós, professores, no sentido de promover pesquisas em conjunto, quanto para os estudantes e ampliar esse diálogo. Então, a gente fica muito feliz com essa possibilidade. Tá? Então, aqui uma apresentação rápida. Tá? O professor Kenneth Aggerholm. Eu fiquei treinando como dizer o sobrenome. Tá? É professor associado do Departamento de Educação Física, da escola da Norwegian School of Sport Science. Ele é originalmente da Dinamarca, mas está trabalhando na Noruega no momento. E trabalha na área de pesquisa. A área de pesquisa é filosofia do esporte, filosofia da educação, filosofia existencial, fenomenologia, ética, desenvolvimento de talento esportivo, educação física adaptada e corporeidade. Tá? Também ele tem no currículo que ele já foi jogador de futebol profissional. E o apelido dele era Agar. Mas ele não conhece o cartoon aquele do Agar, então eu estava mostrando para ele. Tá, mas ele é um Viking mesmo. O original Viking. Deixa eu ver. Então ele tem vários artigos publicados na área, principalmente temáticas associadas com a filosofia do esporte. Tem algumas coisas bem interessantes, muito interessantes, claro, mas algumas que a gente pode destacar. Tem trabalhado também com futebol para pessoas em situação de rua, em Copenhague. Então tem vários, não vou ficar lendo aqui todos os artigos e etc. Mas ele já vamos direto para a fala. Né? Okay, so you are very welcome. We are happy to have you here. So you can start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah? Thank you, Anna. I'm not sure I understood all Anna said, but I hope she said some nice things about me. I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank Anna and Soraya for making this possible. It's I always learn a lot from visiting new places, and this is my first time in Sao Paulo. Only met a few of your colleagues here. It seems like a very nice place. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to try to speak very slowly, and we didn't have time to translate all the slides, but if at some point I get too excited and speak too quickly, or if there's something you don't understand, don't hesitate to raise your hand. We'll have Soraya ready for translation. But otherwise, the plan is to talk about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions afterwards. But please raise your hand if it's too quick or if it is not understandable. Okay. What I'm going to talk about is sport ethics and education. The context of this talk will be competitive youth sport, and I think that's important to clarify in the beginning. I'm not going to talk about physical education, for example. Right now I'm doing some work on, I'm at the Department of Physical Education at the Norwegian School of Sports Science, and I'm doing some work on ethics in physical education, and it's a very different context than youth sport, competitive youth sport, and the role of ethics and the ethics in that domain is different in interesting ways, and we can discuss that afterwards. But in the talk, I'll be focusing on competitive youth sport, and the plan is to try and narrow down some my general approach to the topic in the beginning, raise some questions concerning ethics and sport. After that, I'll introduce some normative ethics, some key positions in normative ethics. Some of you may be familiar with ethics already, but I'll just give a very brief introduction as a kind of background for discussing ethics in relation to sport pedagogy, which will kind of be the main part of the talk. While discuss these ethical positions and how they can inform ethical questions when it comes to sport pedagogy and coaching in youth sport. So that's a plan, and it's based on a chapter I wrote last year for this Scott Kretschmar's Introduction to the Philosophy of Sport. So, and I did you send it to? I sent them to this text to Anna, and she can distribute it if you are interested. Unless you already did it, maybe.
For some people, yes.
Okay.
We can.
You can contact Anna and get the text. The references that I'll be referring to in the talk will all be in that text, so you can. Yeah, look into that if you're interested. Okay? Any questions? So, sport and ethics. What is the relation between sport and ethics? Do you know the British author George Orwell? Yeah, he was furious in 1945. The Russian team Dynamo Moscow visited Britain and played some games, among others against Arsenal. And George Orwell was there, and he observed how sport, in his view, led to some very bad behavior. Both the spectators, they showed nationalism and anger and rage on the tribune, and the players, they acted in violent ways. It was kind of a free for all, he described. It was players could just be violent to each other through this sporting activity. So he was furious, and he went home and wrote an essay on the spirit of sport. And he's not very nice to sport. He sees sport as a place where there's no room for ethics. He wrote, among other things, that sport has nothing to do with fair play. It's bound up with hatred, jealousy, boastfulness, disregard of all rules, and sadistic pleasure in witnessing violence. In other words, it's war minus shooting. Okay, so in his view, sport has nothing to do with ethics. It's bad. It just promotes violence. So that's kind of one way to see it. Sport is bad. There's another famous author, maybe you know, Albert Camus. He was an existential philosopher and a novelist. And he, when he was young, he played, he was the goalkeeper for this Algerian team, RUA. And he had bad lungs, and he wasn't able to play all the roles and the goalkeeper, so he did that, and he was a very good goalkeeper. And he met, among others, an attacker from one of the other teams called Bufarik, I think. He was called the Watermelon. And he gave Camus a very hard time. He was very rude to him. He would push him against the post and be very nasty to him. And then I think 30 years after he played, a magazine editor asked him to write on his experiences with sport. And what Camus describes is that he became sentimental. He thought of the watermelon that gave him a very hard time, and when he reflected on it, he saw something good in the watermelon as well, and he made this famous quote that after many years in which the world has afforded me with many experiences, what I know most surely in the long run about morality and obligations I owe to football. So he saw something, a moral dimension of his experiences in football. So that would kind of be the positive account of sport and ethics, sport and morality. So the question is if we should trust George Orwell, that sport has nothing to do with ethics, it's just war, or if we should listen to Camus and say that we can learn about morality, ethics, by participating in sport. So from these two accounts, I'd like to clarify very briefly some ways that sport philosophers have engaged in this question regarding sport and ethics. And the first position would be very much analog to George Orwell and Camus. It would ask if competitive sport is good. Is competitive sport good? And do you learn about ethics and fair play through participating in sport? By asking this question, you get a yes or a no. And you can find these positions very clearly in the philosophy of sport. Philosophers argue that there are some inherent values in sport that are good. It's called broad internalism, for those of you who may have read some sport philosophy. So they argue that there are some inherent things in sport that promote good values. So you can learn about ethics in sport. And then you have the other position, Werner Müller, for example, my colleague from Aarhus, Denmark, who writes that sport is not a venue for moral issues. He would definitely agree with George Orwell and say that it's just not a place where you can learn about moral things. So yes and no. But then you could also ask another question. You could ask if competitive sport can be good, and can you learn about sport, about ethics and fair play through participating in sport? That will lead to another point of view, or another sport philosophical position, where Jim Perry, who visited here during the 80s, came up with this notion of sport as a moral laboratory, and McPhee has used that more recently to argue that participation in sport can be a place where you learn about ethics, moral issues. It's not necessarily the thing that you actually learn about moral issues, but it can be a place where you can negotiate various moral issues, moral dilemma. It's a laboratory where things can happen, but it's not necessarily. It's not by necessity that sport actually teaches you about moral behavior. So that's another question you can ask about the relation between sport and ethics. Finally, there's a third way of asking about this relation, and that'll be if competitive sport ought to be good, and if you should learn about ethics and fair play through participation in sport. This is a more normative question to ask. It's if you want to answer this, and if you want to work with it, I will argue that you have to engage with sport pedagogy, because pedagogy is a normative activity. You want something with somebody. You actually try and make somebody learn something. You have it's a kind of activity that is governed by values, where you say some things are better than others, and you should go this way when you do pedagogical work. And so if we agree that sport should be a venue where you learn about ethics and fair play, then it's a matter of doing some good pedagogical work to make sport an ethical ground. So that would be my position, and the position I'll describe in the following. So I'll argue that the activity of sport is neither good or bad in itself. It depends on the way you relate to it, the way you engage with it, and that depends on how coaches in youth sport teach it, and how they tell young people to engage with the field of practice. So that's a brief clarification of the way I want to go here. Do you follow? Yeah? Very good. So from that I want to very briefly introduce some ethical positions, normative ethics. Anyone in here familiar with these positions? Not really. let me just briefly clarify. It's a complex field, and there's a lot of disagreement, and neo-Kantians and neo-Aristotelians discuss this in very complex way today. But I'll just try to illustrate the very basics of it. And I also listed consequentialism, utilitarianism, it's also called, which I'll not engage with today, just to let you know that it's there. So deontology, deon is Greek for duty, so it's duty ethics, or ethics that rest on duty, and the key philosopher who promoted this position was Immanuel Kant. And the measure for the good is the universal moral law, and criteria for the good action is actions as a good end in itself. The way that we perform good actions in this understanding is by rationality, principles, duty, and free will. The famous concept in this position is the categorical imperative, which basically means that you should want the maxim or the law for your action to be a universal law. You should want everybody to act by the same principle. For example, if I am to pay my taxes, should I pay my taxes? Should I cheat a little? Should I play with the numbers to pay a little less? Within this position, I would have to ask myself if I could want that principle that it's okay to cheat a little bit as a universal law. And what Kant would say that if you go through that rational process, then you probably would agree that you couldn't want that as a universal law, because if everybody cheated, then we wouldn't have the school and wouldn't have the public goods that we, most of us, rely on. So you couldn't want that kind of behavior as a universal law. What Kant didn't want was for people to act from circumstances and inclination. Ethical behavior couldn't just be what you feel like is right right now. You have to think about the universal moral law. So that's deontology, and the way that you learn moral behavior, moral education in this understanding would focus on rationality, principle, duty, free will. You should actually make use of your ability to act rationally. So that's deontology. I'll get back to very shortly how that would be maybe interesting in relation to sport. And then we have virtue ethics, which is an Aristotelian position. And Aristotle asked, what would be the ultimate good for human beings? And his answer to it would be to lead a good life, which would be to kind of fulfill the purpose of human being. He used the word eudaimonia, which translates into happiness, well-being. So we should pursue eudaimonia as part of leading a good life. And we do that by enacting virtues. Virtues are what contribute to eudaimonia, to the good life. And how do we act virtuously. We do that from habits and from practical wisdom, phronesis, which is more situated, more inactive than Kant's rational ways of behaving. It's a practical rationality, it's practical wisdom. And Aristotle saw virtue as the mean between excess and deficiency, which is the vices. So, for example, Aristotle described courage as a virtue. And what does it mean to be courageous? It's not, you can't, Aristotle would argue, you can't define that once and for all. It's related to the situation, to the danger of the situation, to feel the right amount of fear and act in the courageous way in the situation, between being a coward and being, I don't know the word, overly courageous or just stupid. If you don't have the right amount of fear in the situation. If I'm a defender in football, for example, and I want to make a dangerous pass in my defense, it wouldn't be an action of courage. It would just be stupid to make this dangerous pass. Yeah, virtue is the mean between the two vices. And when it comes to moral education, it's an important implication of this position is that you don't learn about moral behavior by rationalizing and by people telling you what to do. You learn it by doing it, by being in situations where you grow habits, good habits, which is the basis for your moral actions. So it's a more active-based approach to moral education, whereby you can grow a practical wisdom from similar experiences. So that's a very short introduction to those two key positions. So I hope you. I wouldn't expect you to understand fully these two positions, but I hope you can see the differences between them, and then I'll try and apply them to sport and how these can be a good background for thinking about the ways that coaches can work with the relation between sport and ethics and contribute to moral education in youth sport. The deontological approach would tell coaches to focus on formal dimensions and principles in sport. It could inform us to say that taking part in competitive sport, participants have a duty to comply with the formal conditions and principles that prescribe right ways of performing and behaving in sport. So, what could that be? I want you to take a moment to reflect on what could that be in sport. What could be the duty of participants in sport? What would be the kinds of duties that participants should want as a universal moral law in sport participation? Take a minute to think about it. Any suggestions?
Responsibility.
Responsibility? Mm-hmm. Huh?
Follow the rule.
Follow the rules? Yeah?
Fair play.
Fair play, yes. But fair play is a kind of broad notion, so we can discuss that maybe afterwards. I'll try and illustrate how sport philosophers have thought about this question. And the position would be formalism or interpretivism. Are those the sport philosophical branches? You don't have to know those names. But within formalism, a very common point of departure is Bernard Schwitt's and his definition of games and game playing. He describes some formal criteria for engaging in games, and describes that games have a goal, a illusory goal. When I play football, for example, there's a particular specific state of affairs which is defined by the goal, and this becomes a illusory goal when we also consider the means and rules. The illusory means are the means which are permitted in the attempt to achieve the pre-illusory goal. So if I take the ball in my hand and throw it into the goal, I would definitely, the ball would be in the pre-illusory goal, the net, but it wouldn't be a illusory goal because it wouldn't count as a goal in football. So I have to use the means allowed to actually score a goal in football. There are also rules that prohibit the use of most efficient means for putting the ball in the net. For example, taking the ball and going it with my body. That would be much easier. Then it would be difficult for my opponents to tackle, but at the same time it wouldn't make sense if I wanted to play the game of football. So I have to use the means prescribed by the rules. And finally, Bernard Schwitt argues that I have to accept the constitutive rules so the activity is possible. So you have to take a illusory attitude to the game. And he defined game playing as to play a game is to attempt to achieve a specific state of affairs, the pre-illusory goal, using only means permitted by rules, the illusory means, where the rules prohibit use of more efficient in favor of less efficient means, and where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. So this may be a little complex, but let me try and this kind of and he also made the more portable version definition of game playing as the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. That's a very nice definition. So playing a game is to voluntarily attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. On this basis, sport philosophers have made some principles about good ethical behavior in sport, and I'll try and go through them. There are four of them. And first of all, and this is related to the illusory attitude, morally defensible competitions require consent. So, and this is also very elementary in Kant's idea of moral education. It's based on freedom. You cannot force someone to be a moral agent. It rests on our free will, our rationality, our ability to make use of our reasoning. So Participation must be voluntary and freely chosen. Participants have a duty to show the right military attitude. That's kind of a prerequisite for participation in sport to be ethical, defensible, and for moral education to be possible. Secondly, and this is one Fraley who I think it's in '84, he argued that he asked what are the right ends in sport, and he came up with an answer which is trying to win is a right end in sport. You have a duty to attempt to win, to pursue the illusory goal, and that's it couldn't. If you wanted to make the moral exercise of Kant, you couldn't want for everybody to win in sport, right? Somebody has to lose. So that couldn't be your moral obligation, but trying to win is what makes the activity possible. If you don't try to win, then the sport as we know it would make no sense. There was an interesting case in Denmark some years ago where if you the team with the fewest yellow cards would have access to qualification matches to play in Europe, which is kind of a fair play, to promote fair play, to receive the fewest yellow cards. And that's maybe a good idea, but it kind of it led to some absurd matches towards the end of the tournament, where the teams played not to receive yellow cards. They didn't play to win necessarily, because that was irrelevant for qualifying for Europe. So it was some weird matches, which wasn't really, competitive sport. It ruined the game, basically. So trying to win is very, very elementary, and you have a duty to try and win if you take part in competitive sports. If for some reason, and we have match fixing issues here, if you play on your own team losing and try and fix that during the match, then it's just not competitive sport as we know it. It ruins elementary dimensions of sport. So, and that would actually be violating this duty to treat others as ends, not just means. You have to, if you try and lose to gain some money, then you treat your opponents as means to an external end, not as an end in itself. So that's a duty for participants in sport. Thirdly, accepting and complying with the rules, as you said, is the right mean to the sought end in sport. So you have a duty to comply with the rules. If you don't, then you're a cheater, and you violate a very basic dimension of sport. You couldn't want. Some cheat and some get away with it, but I don't think they could want that as a universal moral law in sport, right? If that would allow everyone to go about and cheat, then it would ruin the sport as we know it. So you must accept the less efficient means. For example, only handling the ball with your feet when you play football, not use the hand of God or what else you may be using. So you must use the less efficient means if you want to engage in the game in a moral way. And fourth, just and fair competition requires equal opportunity to perform. This what Sigmund Nolan has described as the fair play principle, a principle of fairness. Participants must be equal at the outset of competition to have the right amount of tension during games. And we have very refined ways of classifying competitors to ensure that they are almost at the same level for exciting games to be possible. And that's that's important. And I think most people in here who took part in games would know that it's not much fun to compete against someone who's much worse than or a much lower level than yourself. It would be too easy. There wouldn't be any good game. And in the same way, it's no fun to play against opponents who are much better than you. You don't stand a chance. There's no excitement, and it's the moral value of sport competition. If you don't have this equal opportunity at the outset of games, it just wouldn't be any fun. So that's 4 basic principles that we could derive from Kant's moral philosophy when we apply it to sport. And when it comes to coaching, I think I'll just highlight some ways that this could inform your practice as a coach in youth sport. And first of all, you'd try to explicate these principles, make the participants aware of how these moral obligations are essential for participating in sport. It's would be a more kind of rational account than the virtue ethical one I'll present in a minute. You shouldn't push young athletes against their will to participate in sport. It has to be based on consent and free will. If it should be moral in any way, and if it should contribute to moral education. I took 2 kind of pedagogical tools from the literature, which I think are interesting and relevant. And the first one would be to make ethical contracts, to discuss with participants to make them aware and accept the ethical principles, to agree on some elementary principles for doing sport. And the sport panels suggestion I also find very relevant, to have the young people debate, have dialogues and reflect on right actions, maybe after some incidents that where some maybe acted in unethical ways. It would be good to discuss it and become more reflective of the morally right ways to engage in sport. So that would be the deontological way of approaching sport and ethics and moral education in sport. How am I on time? 10 minutes? Okay. Now this is all very good, but there are, it may not be all there is to moral issues in sport. This principle, the formal approach to what you have to do as a moral agent in sport. I want to show you this example of I found in golf, which I think illustrates the limits of a formal approach and how we may need to consider another approach. Let's see.
Suzanne Pedersen has issued a lengthy apology for her conduct on the final day of the Solheim Cup, with the Norwegian doing likewise in person to the United States captain Julie Inkster Pedersen prompted fury in the final stages of the event's four-ball session by claiming a hole when one of her opponents, Alison Lee, mistakenly picked up her ball in the belief a short putt had been conceded. The United States went on to reclaim the Solheim Cup from Europe, with Pedersen's actions widely recognized as a key motivating factor. In the aftermath of the competition in Germany, Pedersen was utterly unrepentant. That stance changed on Monday morning when the two-time major winner took to her Instagram account. Pedersen said, "I've never felt more gutted and truly sad about what went down Sunday on the 17th at the Solheim Cup."
Okay, did you, maybe some you're not that familiar with golf. Let me just quickly explain what happened was that normally a putt this far from the hole would be, you give it, you don't have to do the putt. So Sørensen here and her teammates went away, and the American player picked up the ball, and then Sørensen said, "Oh, we didn't allow that." And according to the formal rules, she was entitled to do that. She didn't break any rule of the game. But their conduct, the fact that they went away, they showed that normally that way of moving would say, okay, you can just skip the putt. So she didn't break the formal rule, but she violated the kind of the unwritten rules of the game. So that's, I thought that was,
Suzanne Pedersen has issued a lengthy apology for her conduct on the final day of the...
Kenneth, is it the same when the football player, for instance, gets some injury and then someone falls in the ground and then they shoot out the ball and then in return they return the ball?
Yeah, you know that some of you may have seen in football, if there's an injury, you play the ball out, and then afterwards, when the player is either substituted or back on his or her legs, then you give the ball back. That's not written in the formal rule book, but it's a common way of showing sportsmanship or fair play in football. So that's
football terms is better for us.
Okay, yeah. But I think it's interesting to see what Suzanne Pedersen wrote afterwards. She regretted this, and on her Instagram profile, she wrote that she felt gutted and truly sad about what went down. I'm so sorry for not thinking about the bigger picture in the heat of the battle and competition. I was trying my hardest for my team and put the single match and the point that could be earned ahead of sportsmanship and the game of golf itself. I hope in time the US team will forgive me and know that I've learned a valuable lesson about what is truly important in this great game of golf, which has given me so much in life. And I want to work hard to earn back your belief in me as someone who plays hard, plays fair, and plays the great game of golf in the right way. So there's some interesting things in her quote here that a sport philosopher could hardly have formulated better about sportsmanship and playing golf in the right way, which is a dimension that transcends the formal rules. I think what we need to kind of analyze and enact this dimension of the game is a virtue ethical perspective on moral agency and moral development in sport. And the general focus here would be on sport as a social and valued practice, which is another position in the philosophy of sport. And here we can analyze what Suzanne Pedersen described as sportsmanship and playing the game in the right way. can be analyzed as the internal goods of this sport, as the standards of excellence, ethos, conventions, norms, unwritten rules, the spirit of sport. These are different terms that are indeed different, but I kind of collect them here to describe this this dimension. So I'll just use them intertwined, though there are some differences. So what we have here is a dimension that or it's not a duty for participants necessarily. The games could be played without this, but it makes sport a valuable field of practice, and therefore participants should enact and uphold the history, the traditions, the norms, and the appropriate customs that belong to their sport. They should play sport in the right way. I don't think we. How are we on time? Okay. Take just a brief minute to consider what could be the virtues, the unwritten rules, the right ways of participating in sport. Any suggestions?
Learn to accomplish.
Yeah?
Respect.
Respect? Yeah. Which is also a key word in FIFA's fair play promotions, yeah. Respect. It's not, it may not be a necessity for playing the game. It wouldn't violate the formal criteria maybe for playing the game, but it's important if you want the game to be for participants to engage in the right way and yeah, promote some good values by anything. I'll try and highlight some possible. There could be many. I'll try and highlight some on basis of virtue ethics. Now, in general, it will be a case of showing sportsmanship. Arnold has defined as a certain type of commendatory acts done in sport which are not obligatory, like the formal criteria before, but which enrich it as a worthwhile practice. So, in the formal understanding of moral actions, participants have a duty to try and win. The additional aspect in a virtue ethical perspective would be to try and win in a proper and desirable way for the game to be a good game. And this depends on the ethos, the norms, etc. of the particular sport. It wouldn't be possible to describe the proper and desirable way to try and win in games in general. There are very different ways of acting in a good way in games. There are gentleman sports that require certain ways of behaving, yeah. So it depends on the particular sport. It's not a universal moral law, as Kant would argue. There are some social virtues in sport that participants should experience and enact. Sport philosophers have outlined some. I guess there'll be more, but some would be friendship, teamwork, humor, goodwill, fairness, generosity, collaboration, humility, commitment, loyalty, respect, contrition, and trust. So for example, when it comes to friendship, it may be kind of contradictory to see competitive youth sport as a matter of friendship. But for example, the sport philosopher Drew Hyland has argued that we should actually see competitive events as something to be enacted in a mode of friendship, because we couldn't have this meaningful activity unless there was an opponent that tried to do to counteract your what you tried to do to score the goal there. If we play football, whereas I tried to score the goal there, so this tension between competitors in sport is what makes the sport possible. So, and the right way of engaging in this is not to try and destroy your opponent. It is to make your best to counteract his intentions, and we have every reason to give each other the hand, to make the handshake after the match, because it wouldn't be possible without the opponent. So this would be a way of acknowledging the opposition in sport. We also have individual virtues in sport. Sport philosophers have argued that we should experience and enact resilience, practicing hard work, effort, courage, perseverance, and discipline, and that these are ways of enacting in sport to make it a valuable field of practice. And then we have finally sport as forming part of the good life. That would be kind of the overall aim for participating in sport. Participants should experience integrity and constancy. We should see sport as part of their whole life. For example, if we take cyclists, I think it's quite disturbing sometimes to see these cyclists come out after they ended their career and admitting to having used doping, which may have been kind of okay in their field of practice, but they've been lying to people around them, so they kind of led a double life. And in a virtue ethical perspective, that wouldn't be morally sustainable in any way. You have to make sport a part of your life as a whole. As part of that, participants should understand why they do sport, the meaning of their engagement. So that's kind of a broader perspective on moral engagement in sport. When it comes to the sport pedagogy, there's a rather different approach it requires from coaches than the deontological one I described a little earlier. There's this notion that initiating participants into the social practice is kind of a crucial approach for coaches. It's not so much about telling participants what is right and what is wrong. It's about promoting some or cultivating sportive virtues, the internal goods of the community of practice, by, for example, creating an environment with good norms and values, whereby participants can get the good habits that moral actions rest on in this perspective. So it's about doing the good thing, have some good values in the community to teach participants how to behave. and yeah, act like an admirable role model as a coach. Show it, don't tell it, right? You have to actually do it yourself in order for the participants to be able to not rationally reflect on what is the right principles of engagement, but show the good ways of behaving in sport. And you should be sensitive to concrete persons and situations. There are no universal laws in this perspective. What is right depends on the subject engaged and the concrete situation, for example, the particular sport you engage in. So there's another level of sensitivity in this approach to coaching. And as Sigmund Nolan has argued, coaches should be enlightened generalists that do not just try to facilitate sportive excellence, but human excellence by seeing sport as part of the good life. So you don't have this narrow focus on developing skills and being the best in your area. You have to see it in a more a broader perspective, and nurture an awareness of why you do sport. If it's to be a morally sustainable activity. So that's that'll be the virtuous approach to sport coaching. So, to conclude, I hope I'm not too much over time.
No.
I tried to outline these two general approaches, and it's not. I'll by no means argue that I emptied this topic and said everything there is to say about it. I hope I have clarified two different approaches that can both in their own ways be valuable, but sport and ethics and the development of moral character are indeed complex and ambiguous matters, so it's not, there's no clear answer to it. And I think the take-home message I would like to stress here is what I started by saying is that if sport is to be good, it requires good pedagogical work from coaches, because the moral value of this field of practice depends on the way it's enacted and experienced by participants. So sport in itself is not good or bad, it depends on how we engage in it, and that depends on how coaches do their pedagogical work in relation to it. Obrigado.
Thanks, Kenneth, for your speech. So we have lots of things. Temos muitas coisas para pensar. É uma área bastante ampla de discussão, a ética de modo geral e a ética em relação ao esporte. Então, temos aqui algum tempo para pergunta ainda. Quem quiser.
Thank you, Professor, for your speech. And in the beginning, you told us about the difference between physical education and coaching for sport. And I don't know, could you explain a little bit about this difference between ethics in physical education, I don't know, in Norway, and when we are coaching? Because here in Brazil, well, I understand that as the philosopher Jorge Olímpio Bento, the Portuguese philosopher, I don't know if you know, the physical educator, the professional of physical education, he always has the pedagogical work in your hands. And physical education, even in school or outside I believe, must be the same, must have the same principles. I don't know. But in Brazil, the codes, I think, they don't follow these principles. They care more about the physiological and tactical and about the skills. So, watching your speech, I feel I'm looking for we are talking in physical education in school here in Brazil, and I would like to know the difference in school in Norway.
Thank you. Thank you. Does this work? Yeah. That's a very good question. I cannot yet comment on the differences between the Brazilian system and the Norwegian system. I'm not that familiar with how physical education is here. But what I can comment on is the difference, which in general, does this work? Yeah. The difference between competitive youth sports as it's conducted in associations and clubs and physical education in school. I think what would be interesting maybe would be to, in general, sport philosophers have described how the value of competition can also be a value for participants in physical education. And I think often you see a kind of uncritical way of praising the way that competition can be meaningful in people's life in general, and just taking that into the context of school, physical education. But I think there may be good reasons to be a little more concerned about the way that we teach and use competitive games in school. Let me try and, I think these principles may be a valuable point of departure, outset for discussing this. If, for example, we agree that morally defensible competitions require consent, then we may often pupils in school have the possibility of choosing which activities they want to engage in, but not always. And so if they don't have a choice, if they want to participate in football, other competitive activities, could it then be morally defensible? Then we wouldn't have consent from, it's obligatory, right? You have to be in physical education. You don't, it's not like in clubs where you choose what to do. It's compulsory in school. So that's already a kind of a moral, a good question to ask if you want to study if it's morally defensible. And I'm not saying that it cannot be, but there are some differences, obvious differences between if you choose to engage in participating in competitive sport in a club, and if you have to be in physical education and compete even though you don't want to. And also the last one, just and fair competition requires equal opportunity to perform. Can we always make sure that this is the case in physical education? We don't have, in sport, there are very good ways of arranging games. We have leagues, we have weight classes, we have various criteria based on age, weight, sex, etc. to classify competitors, participants in sport, so they meet opponents at the same level. We don't have that in physical education. There's a class, a collection of people grouped by criteria that are not normally, I take, that's the case in Norway at least, they're not grouped by the level of skills in relation to various sports. So, can competitive activities then be meaningful and morally defensible if we have some very good pupils and some very bad pupils? Would it make sense for them to compete at all? Would it be morally, in sport philosophy, many argue that you can learn from losing. It can be morally edifying to lose a game because you learn from it and you can be strengthened by it. But could the same be possible in physical education? If you don't stand a chance, you just run over by someone who has played football for many years, you've never done it yourself before. Would that be morally defensible? Would it be any fun? Probably not. So then in sport education, which is kind of a pedagogical model of physical education, you have these various solutions where you make teams across classes, where you actually select based on the level of skills, which makes the activity more meaningful. But at the same time, I'm not sure if the ethical, if we should be concerned about that from a moral perspective. So and trying to win. If teams are very, if participants have very different skill levels, trying to win may not be make sense. Peter Eirik Leierhaug, one of my colleagues, just presented. We come from a conference in Vancouver, and he presented on the notion of fair play in physical education, where he discusses, we use the term fair play, that's part of the learning goals in Norway. It's very central in the curriculum to learn about fair play. But he discussed in relation to this, trying to win, which is a central part of fair play in youth competitive sport. So that he discussed if it makes sense and if we should have a different notion of fair play, because if you don't meet people at the same skill level, then trying to win would not necessarily be the most central part of competitive activities. So many, I think taking competitive games into the context of physical education raises some interesting moral questions. Thank you for the question.
Hi, and thank you for class. So I would like to know how to engage young students to not go for an anti-doping strategy, since we tend to forget things. Like we saw Sharapova, she was playing last week in US Open, and all this scandals was, I think it was like nearly 1 year ago. But there were loads of people supporting and cheering for her, in spite of all this scandals. So how to talk to the young people, not to go and follow the doping path, and go like doing the fair play instead.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's relevant. It's something I kind of skipped in this talk. There are many from a moral perspective, there are many ways you could approach doping issues. I think maybe the most obvious way of approaching would, most straightforward approach would be to focus on the principle 3 here, that when you engage in sport, you have to accept and comply with the rules as the right mean to the sought end in sport. You have to accept the use of less efficient means prescribed by constitutive rules. I think if you let me think. If you do a sport and you take some kind of performance-enhancing drug, then you may not be using the less efficient means to reach your goal. Then you try and make your body stronger. You violate the rules that say that you cannot take these drugs. So you kind of you enhance your ability to perform in ways that violate the rules of the game as they are described by Vada. And so if you do the Kantian exercise of asking yourself, okay, I play tennis, I'm Sharapova, and I take this performance-enhancing drug to gain more strength. Could I want that as, could I want the maxim, or the general rule for that action as a universal moral law to go for everybody in the field of tennis? And I think if she did that Kantian exercise, I think the answer would have to be no, because if everybody took the same performance-enhancing drug as her, then the competitive effect or the competitive advantage she gained from taking that drug wouldn't be there anymore if everybody took it. So she definitely couldn't want that as a universal moral law, that you can enhance your physical ability by taking this or that drug. So if she went through that exercise and she was a rational and responsible agent, then her answer would have to be no, and she wouldn't take the drug. But then I know sometimes human beings are not responsible, rational agents, right? So it wouldn't have to be it wouldn't necessarily solve any issues, but it may be a way of making, as a coach, making your athletes reflect on this. Also, there was a case of swimming suits some years ago, where suddenly they invented these swimming suits so they could just swim much faster, and new records were set. And then slowly everybody began to use these swimming suits, and they were no longer allowed, right? So that's kind of a similar example where some gain a competitive advantage by some technological advancement, but could they want that as a universal law or as something allowed for everybody? Well, not really if they want to have the competitive advantage. I think that might be somehow similar. I think from a virtue ethical perspective. I think I've argued in a paper that practicing and hard work is actually part of the moral landscape in sports. And I argue against Bill Morgan, who said that earlier he presented the argument that the performance-enhancing drugs that affect the performance are not morally defensible, whereas performance-enhancing drugs that only affect preparation for performance are not morally problematic. And I just I don't see how that makes sense. I think part of an essential part of competing in sport is to be preparing and to train and practice towards performance. And if you somehow take drugs that affect or means that you don't have to work as hard towards performance as others do, then that's morally problematic. So that may be a more virtue ethical approach to that you can use to make athletes reflect on what they should or should not.
Okay, one more question?
Quick question. How about coaches? When they train you how to cheat?
Yeah.
Yes, it's very common in football. I can train how to fall down, to cheat on the judge.
Was that Neymar's coach you think of? Yeah, I think that would, in all respects, be morally problematic. Yeah, that's kind of. I mean, that's a big problem in football, and in my view, today in modern football. Actually, I saw the European Championship in women's football a month ago, and that was so enjoyable to watch. They didn't have all these theatrical ways of performing. They just played the game. It was so much nicer to watch than Camille's football today. But I think in all ways that would be morally dubious. I think yeah, create a good an environment with good norms and values, to cultivate sportive virtues and good habits. I think that would just be the most clear example of not doing that, and maybe again, maybe it would also be useful to take the more Kantian approach and ask if everybody practiced diving, and what kind of game would we have then? Would that be the kind of game that we want? So the answer to if we could want practicing towards diving and acting in various theatrical ways that are not directly related to playing the game, would have to be no. We don't want that for we don't want everybody to practice that. So yeah, that would be, in my view, that would be problematic in many ways. I think you have a moral responsibility as a coach to promote the good virtues of your particular sport.
Question.
Very short.
Okay. Thank you for the nice presentation.
Thank you.
And I would like to ask,
First, the vision of the physical education in Norway, if you can share it with us. And also, if you can tell us who can decide this is ethical or non-ethical. You know that we have a different culture, we have a different belief, so who can make the decision, this is ethical or non-ethical? Thank you.
In competitive sport or in physical education?
In both.
In both, okay. Okay, so first, the vision of physical education in Norway. I think the most central part of the curriculum states that physical education should promote or facilitate lifelong engagement in activities or something like that. Lifelong enjoyment of movement. That would kind of be the central aspect of it. So it's about making students experience various ways of moving to find their own meaning in movement, so that they will enjoy to be physically active in the long run. That's kind of the, and then you have various sub aims. For example, fair play, which features that students should learn about fair play in physical education. But it's not that specific about what fair play then is. So that's what my colleague Peter Eirik, for example, has started to question, and which I would also like to engage more in. But lifelong enjoyment of being physically active, that's kind of the main goal. And the other one, who decides or who judges whether something is ethical or not? I think, I mean, that there are ethical boards in most countries, and ethical boards in kind of transnational organizations who judge ethical issues. So that would kind of be the formal, you know, if you play football in most leagues, I imagine, and you purposely touch the ball with your hand, the referee doesn't see it, or you spit at someone and the referee doesn't see it, then they can, based on video, ban you for some matches. So I mean, the referee, the boards would kind of be the formal ones to judge, I guess. But then there's always, I mean, in the case of Sørensen here, she kind of there was no formal ban of her, or there was no kind of formal decision that this is not ethical. But there was so many comments and so many reactions to it in this community of practice, so that she realized that, oh, maybe this wasn't actually the right thing to do. So there's always many informal ways of, you know, we do it all the time. Decent and good ways of conduct, of engaging with other people are constantly regulated between human beings. So I think that there's always a more informal way of judging if what you do is right or wrong. So I don't know if that's in physical education. I'm not so sure. The teacher has a huge responsibility, I guess. Maybe more than the coach. I don't know, but it would essentially be the teacher, right, who enforces or facilitates the good ways of behaving. But then again, there's also within the group young people. There's a huge, the ways of regulating behavior there as well. Maybe you're bullied if you stand out, and then maybe someone stands up against the bullying, and there are many more informal regulations there as well. But essentially, I think that the teacher is a responsibility of the teacher to ensure that the students engage in physical education in good and morally defensible ways.
Okay. So we need to finish now. Muito obrigada a todos vocês que estiveram aqui presentes. Esse tema da ética é um dos grandes temas dentro da filosofia e dentro da filosofia do esporte. Nós temos trabalhado bastante com essa área de uma maneira mais ampla, mas todos esses temas são relevantes para a reflexão no curso de Educação Física e Esportes. Nós gostaríamos que, inclusive, termos mais momentos, né, com essas reflexões. Eu gostaria de mencionar também que a instituição na qual o professor Kenneth trabalha é bastante tradicional na área da filosofia do esporte. Atualmente tem entre 6 a 8 professores trabalhando na área, o que é bastante, e alguns professores muito conhecidos já há um bom tempo produzindo nessa área. Para nós é um prazer estabelecer uma relação de pesquisa mais próxima. Nesse evento de filosofia do esporte que nós temos participado já há algum tempo, também o professor Kenneth tem trazido algumas questões intrigantes. Por exemplo, nesse último evento no qual nós estivemos, ele apresentou um trabalho sobre bubbles and squats, sobre uma análise sobre dionisíaca, sobre esses eventos que nós temos agora, em que mistura fitness com consumo de álcool, né, festas e corrida com cerveja, etc. Né? Tem vários eventos, então, uma reflexão bem interessante sobre isso, sobre esse tema, sobre a presença do riso e da diversão nas atividades físicas, sobre a presença da teatralidade nos jogos de futebol. Enfim, são questões bem intrigantes que fazem parte do cotidiano da atividade física e do esporte e que sugerem elementos interessantes para a nossa reflexão. O tema da ética é um tema que suscita, principalmente nos chama a atenção para a necessidade da reflexão constante sobre questões éticas e morais, né? Questões de decisão e discussão coletiva, não apenas de seguir regras, né? Mas pensar sobre essas regras e como é que a gente trabalha com isso então na nossa área. Só lembrando também que amanhã, então, às 2 horas, The Meaning of Sport, também com o professor Kenneth, na sala 60, tá? Já confirmando aqui a sala, certo? O texto também deixaremos em disponibilidade para vocês os 2 textos. A gente vai passar para o pessoal da pesquisa para disponibilizar no site. Os capítulos são capítulos de livro, então é bom ter acesso. E nós temos aqui um certificado para agradecer a gente. Thank you very much for your presence. É isso, obrigada.